Hi, everybody. Tim Neal here from LogiSense, and I am joined with Toby Bargar from Avalara, who's a senior tax specialist. And we are here to talk about part 2 of our series of the Wild West of IoT Taxation, where we start to take a look more at how do we manage, a system of constant change of taxes through different, state, county, federal levels, and what are the different approaches for that? And being able to have Toby here as an expert in this field is a great way where we can kind of pick his brain and see if we can find out some different information on how these sorts of things are managed. So Toby, thanks a lot for joining us. And maybe we'll just kind of jump right in with, at the beginning, like what are some of the challenges around regulations that we typically see out there? Is it the breadth of change? What are those sorts of things that you typically are dealing with at Avalara?
Yeah, well, the question on the slide actually kind of hits one of the nails right on the head there, that one of the biggest challenges is the fact that you're dealing with a variety of different, government agencies and entities. That there's the FCC that, of course, is in play with communication services in general, but then also state Department of Revenues, state regulatory agencies, public service commissions, public utility commissions, all the way down to, we have some states that have home rule tax compliance where you have to actually file individually with each local and county government. You can wind up with a single transaction on a single invoice triggering 4, 5, 6 different filing obligations. So right off the top, the number of taxes and entities that you're dealing with is probably one of the biggest challenges there. Having a good grasp on the relationship of all of those items is also kind of a particular challenge. One of the things a lot of people don't necessarily account for when they're getting into the world of having to deal with communications tax compliance is that roughly half of the stuff that we at Avalara calculate every day to put on people's communications bills is technically the legal responsibility of the seller. They wind up getting passed on as recovery surcharges and regulatory surcharges and things like that. And roughly half of it is truly what we'd call a fiduciary tax, where you're actually collecting money on behalf of the government, and you put it in your bank account and you're storing it on their behalf and ultimately going to pass it back to them. But those are two really important distinctions, and you have to kind of make sure that you're set up to properly segregate all of that and manage effectively the ledger accounting for what you do with the recovery surcharges versus the fiduciary taxes. And one of the trickier, more painful aspects of it is it's really common that the true fiduciary taxes, your sales taxes and your retail excise taxes, things like that, will need to then tax some of those recovery surcharges. So you need systems that can kind of take all that into account and make sure that you're on top of what's going on with the interaction of all the different pieces.
Right. And I think, one of the big things that I think is a major challenge, right, is really, you're dealing with all of these different entities, as you'd mentioned, but then kind of they decide to change things on a basis. What kinds of things do you guys see as far as, how often do some of these different rules and taxes and things change as you're dealing with these different entities?
Yeah, well, it's a real mixture. So some of the things that we deal with change on a predictable fixed cycle, right? They'll have a time of the year that they change at the calendar year, or at the end of certain quarters or things like that. So it's a predictable rhythm, and that there's going to likely be changes, and go out and look for them. But then there's also a certain segment of the taxes that can change randomly whenever the tax jurisdiction gets the legislative throughput to make that happen, right? And so it's important to be able to kind of filter for both and be aware of both. Those of us in the tax automation world, unfortunately, there's no rest for the weary on that. You kind of have to make sure that you have a process that you're both catching all of the things that have a predictable and regular pattern, but then also looking out for all of the things that have an irregular pattern. Sometimes it's well telegraphed ahead of time and you know the things are changing. Sometimes it's right up to the last minute. Most things do change at least at the first of the month. That's the most predictable aspect of it, is that you know, they will mostly take place first month, but we do, even then, there's not a hard rule. Sometimes we'll have some jurisdictions that will have a city council meeting and, you know, pass a new tax rate, and it's effective at the adjournment of the meeting. You know, so there's circumstances like that out there, and occasionally we wind up having to put out supplemental tax changes in the middle of a month, but most of the time monthly.
Right. Now, what kind of like granularity are in some of these use cases, right? Like some might be thinking, oh, well, maybe that, you know, state changes its statewide tax, right, on a service or something like that. But, you know, how granular does some of these different changes get down when it comes to a communication standpoint?
Yeah, so there's granularity in multiple directions with that, right? In that some states do indeed have you know, local taxation of these services, and some, you know, in the cases of, for example, sales taxes and a handful of some of the retail communications taxes, you can actually get below the state level, right? That there's changes that affect you know, taxation around transit systems or ambulance districts, or, you know, tax rates that get passed to fund stadium improvements, or, you know, retail improvement districts. You know, you'll build a shopping center and pass an extra increment of sales tax to collect within the shopping center. And it's easy if you're going and programming the cash register, you know, at the new shop inside of the shopping center that's subject to the extra increment of sales tax. A lot of people don't realize that if you sell, you know, data services or communication services or phone services to the retail shops in that shopping center, you're legally expected to know that you need to collect an extra increment of sales tax because they're inside of that particular special taxing district. So it can get down to a pretty micro level. There are definitely areas of the country where you cross the street and the tax rates change. So it is important to make sure that you're on top of that. It also gets very granular in the billing sense as well, and that's something a lot of people are kind of sometimes taken aback if they're new to the US tax system in particular, is that on a typical communications bill, there's oftentimes a variety of different types of services there, right? You know, it's relatively rare that folks are selling something completely homogenous. And more often than not, there's going to be different tax treatments for those different pieces, right? You know, so if you've got multiple things going on in your invoicing, you're going to probably wind up with situations where there's one palette of taxes that applies to this component, and a different palette that applies to, you know, other components, and that all, you know, starts to add up into a lot of very micro detail of what you're looking at.
Yeah, for sure. And that's one of the things that we're always advising our clients is, you know, the way that we structure our product catalog is to be able to, you know, maybe you're selling a product that's got multiple different, you know, services or features that are in it that could be very well taxed differently depending on what the services that are offered on those. So being able to break out each of your different services with the proper taxation assigned to each one of them versus putting it on the whole package in itself typically will allow you to save your customers money by not having to pay the highest tax across all of the different items that are underneath that bundle. So that level of granularity of breaking out your product catalog, you know, down to the proper codes that you need for taxation is really important to help you being competitive, you know, from a pricing perspective. Now, from an IoT perspective, right, we talked a little bit about this in the, you know, part one is that, you know, there's so many small little granular types of transactions, and how are they going to be, you know, classified and those sorts of things? Do we predict kind of, you know, a new set of different categorizations that would then be individually taxed on the types of transmissions that might be happening in here? You mentioned some of the other different kind of services from a voice perspective, but would that granularity also, you know, we think will exist from an IoT perspective as well?
Yeah, you know, for some of us who've been, you know, working in contacts for a long time, you can remember back to the days of traditional long distance billing, and when we used to send out lots of invoices with every phone call identified, and the calling points and the specific charges and all of the details of a phone call. And in that era, it was really important to tax each of those phone calls, individually, because we had to kind of do a complicated analysis on the location points of all three elements: the billing location, the termination location, the origination location. And so you might have hundreds of phone calls on an invoice and wind up with many different taxes in different jurisdictions. With IoT, it kind of depends a little bit probably on the use case of the seller, and a little bit on the distribution of the customer use of the service, right? Because the big issue there is as to whether or not you still need to look at all of those transactions down to the individual granular level. Is going to likely deal a lot with the distribution of the tax citing, right? So if you do indeed have a scenario where you have a great large bulk of transactions that are all associated with one physical location, and it's all essentially the same type of data product, there is potentially some opportunity to aggregate that for tax purposes, right? If it's all the same thing sold in the same place to the same person, then the variables are probably going to be the same across the transactions, right? But if there's distribution that they've got a variety of different sites involved in different taxing locations and different parameters associated with those transactions, anytime you start changing any of the variables, then that ability to sort of consolidate the granular detail kind of goes out the window, because you are potentially introducing elements that are going to change the tax answer. So it really is kind of important to analyze on a use case basis as to what the particular situation of the seller and buyer looks like.
Right. And I think, one of those other ones, right, is from a use case perspective is, are these communications crossing boundaries, right? And different jurisdictions, and, from the aspect of internet traffic, it's internet traffic, but, will some of these things of those use cases of being in different jurisdictions also likely play into that?
Yeah, we touched upon that in the United States. You can potentially might have this argument, if you're inclined to be on the more aggressive side, that this is internet and not subject to tax in the first place, thanks to PITFA, and that kind of depends on whether you want to go there. But it's important to recognize that outside of the United States, that becomes probably a bit of a moot conversations. Most VAT countries, most VAT regimes do apply some degree of VAT to even internet access. So regardless of whether or not we're dealing with it in a WAN context or an internet context, it's likely going to trigger some form of tax. Now, there are countries that have reduced VAT rates or reduced service tax rates, et cetera, that would apply to data or internet services, so that can come into play. But it's not the rosy picture that, hey, I've got this potential argument or case over here to say that this is this great tax-free category of ISP. So yes, if you're selling services to overseas customers and are going to have a compliance obligation in those jurisdictions, then absolutely need to look into the local VAT or service tax obligations. If it does cross border, there is potentially some precedent, in the traditional LAN WAN model. If you had wired circuits, for example, that were crossing internationally from one country to the other, that you would typically split the taxation between the countries and move accordingly. And there are special functions within the tax automation system to account for those sorts of transactions as well. So.
Perfect. Yeah, so lots of different considerations thinking about there, especially those with services that might have IoT devices that are traveling between locations, shipping containers or different things like that are mobile and on the move, and things you want to try to take into consideration. So that's all we have for today for this session, talking about kind of managing change and how you need to be able to take some different things into consideration. I wanted to really thank Toby for all of his information on this session. We hope everybody will join us for the third part of this series, where we start talking about kind of the required reporting around taxation that comes along with this as well, in the regulatory aspects for communication. So thanks again for joining us in this session. Thanks again, Toby, for all the great information, and we hope to see you in the next video.